Hi. So today I wanted to make a different type of video, and it's a video that is basically about something really near and dear to my heart. And I'm hopeful that by sharing this, it might be helpful or interesting to you. I want to be clear that when I do share everything I'm going to share in this video today, it is my personal experience. This isn't something I'm suggesting that anybody has to or must adopt as a part of their healing or their journey or their lives. I just think it might be helpful or validating or maybe just interesting to anybody who wants to listen. So, basically, what this is all about is about that spirituality and a relationship to God have actually been one of the biggest and most impactful things on my own healing journey. And it's something I really don't talk about much on this channel. And of course, I'm not going to turn this channel into like something all about that exclusively at all. But I don't talk much about this on this channel because I don't think that a relationship to God has to look a certain way for everybody. I really like to take the dogma out of it and make it more about a personal relationship to God than some sort of structure or framework that it has to fit into. And I also don't think that you have to have a relationship to God to be a good person. I really don't believe that. I know many incredible, really good people who just have a true moral compass and operate by good values. And so I'm not here to discriminate on this topic, but just to share a little bit about me. And I hope it's helpful or interesting to you in some way. So, if any of you already know this, I mean, many of you probably do know this because I've shared quite a bit about this on this channel over the years. But before I ever started PDS, before I ran a coaching practice for about a decade or so, or anything of that nature, I was actually on a really intense sort of spiritual path. And it wasn't just spirituality, it was sort of trying to overlap spirituality with psychology and understanding the mind. And a big part of the reason that I was on this path in such a really intense way was because from 14, just before I turned 15 until partway through being 20 years old, I was addicted to opioids and honestly struggled terribly. I didn't know how to be sober as a person or really relate to people in a sober way as a young adult. Like, I just sort of feel like I went into this early sort of adult time and I didn't know how to function properly. And I was a really sensitive kid with really big feelings, and I stuffed everything down. And as many of you know, I was a fearful avoidant attachment style. And I don't know if anybody listening to this has ever struggled with sobriety before, but during the times that you decide that you want to get sober or start living a better life, it is one of the hardest and most defeating things to tell yourself over and over again that you're going to get clean, that you're going to live a better life, that you're going to do things differently, and just fall back into that same pattern. And what that makes you feel is like you're weak and you're helpless and you can't do anything right and you fail at everything because the one thing that you're trying to commit to doing for yourself, you just can't even seem to do. And so, geez, if I can't even like live a normal life like everybody else that I'm seeming to look at around me, well, how can I do anything in life? And that was something that was so deep for me and so raw during that period of time. And so, I was high functioning enough from the outside that during that period of time, like I went to university and got a D1 soccer scholarship. And, I'm sure from the outside, my life looked like I had it together, but I was getting in some trouble and, I just wasn't really fitting into how I should be showing up on the team and missing things and just, and on the inside, people who are closer to me probably knew like this girl's struggling in some capacity. I think that was pretty clear, but I don't think anybody really knew just how bad or how deep that was running for me. And on the inside, it was just extremely, extremely difficult. So I feel like I was very accustomed to suffering. I would say that as much as like I had some childhood trauma and there was a lot of confusion for me growing up in different cases and around different things that obviously created that fearful, avoidant, disorganized attachment style, I felt like just being in the space of operating as an addict and what that felt like and what that experience was its own traumatic thing. It was almost like this secondary kind of layer. And again, I don't think people realize unless they've been through an experience like that, like how deep that is and how much it hurts. Like, it's just a really, really tough thing. And I was in a psychology class one day at school, my life falling apart in the process. And somebody said to me that your conscious mind cannot outwill or overpower your subconscious mind. And to me, and I've shared about this before because this was like literally one of the most impactful moments of my life. To me, in one moment, as somebody who had spent years being like putting myself down and being so hard on myself and telling myself like I'm never going to be able to do anything in my life. I can't even get sober. I can't even like get my own internal life together. Suddenly I realized like, oh, it's not that I'm like weak and useless and terrible at everything and can't do anything right. It's that there's something going on where my conscious mind is intending to get sober and get my life back together. And my subconscious is obviously prioritizing numbness because, on some level, that makes my life easier. And so I need to figure out what that means. And like literally in that moment, it was such a strong light bulb moment for me of like, oh, that's why I operate the way I do, something at the subconscious level of mind. So I became obsessed with trying to learn about the subconscious mind. Like, over time, I sort of like substituted one addiction for another, which became something much healthier, which was like learning about all of these things. So I would read books. I did like a year-long hypnosis certification, NLP certifications, like research, research, read nonstop. But one of the first things that I was told to do when I started like seeking out mentorship, and I found this really amazing mentor who was very much like a spiritual mentor. And he said, what if you're trying to understand your subconscious mind, you have to start observing your thoughts. You have to start observing your internal reality. And one of the best things you can do is start meditating. And so I had this day where I sat down and I decided, okay, I'm going to start meditating. And I sat down, and this was so interesting. So I sat there and I closed my eyes and I was like, I'm going to meditate and I'm going to try to focus on my breath. And in the moment, and I was like, I'm going to try to observe my thoughts. And in that moment that I sat down and started to do it, I was like, I heard my internal dialogue. Because at this point, I was not aware. Like, I knew that I felt badly about my ability to like figure things out. And I knew that when somebody said, oh, your subconscious mind, I knew that that was why I was not able to like will myself into getting sober, no matter how much I thought that I wanted that at a conscious level. I had this like big realization, but I didn't realize until this moment where I'm sitting down to meditate how mean I was to myself in my own internal dialogue, because I had just always been like identified with my thoughts. Like my thoughts were just running my life. So I sat down, I closed my eyes, and I heard myself go, you're not going to be able to do this. This is stupid. You're going to mess this up like everything else. You're not going to be able to, like, and I just was being so mean to myself. And in that moment, I realized, oh, this is what I'm numbing. This is what I'm running from. Because if somebody followed me around all day and spoke to me like this, and I had kind of these light bulb moments of like how I'm so hard on myself, literally 24/7 all the time. And if somebody spoke to me like this and followed me around and talked to me this way, I would want to numb them out too somehow. So no wonder I'm trying to numb myself all the time. So I became like obsessed with learning first about like the subconscious mind, but also about meditation. And I tried all sorts of practices. I went to classes. I learned like everything that I could about meditation and different techniques. I did like one of those, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, with the transcendental meditation certification program, and like went through that whole sort of spiritual experience. And it was during this time that something really powerful started to happen to me. And it was that the more I stopped identifying with my thoughts, the more they would just like run on autopilot all the time, the more I would meditate and observe them, the more I would feel this sense of peace. Like, and it was this deep, deep feeling of peace I had never felt or experienced before. And at the same time, I was learning about, all these different spiritual practices. And I was sort of trying to really overlap where there was this sort of like meeting point between spirituality and psychology, like what was happening in my mind and what was happening from this sort of spiritual meditative space. Because at the time I would come home, like I got so obsessed. I am kind of a bit of an obsessive person. Like I really go headfirst into things and I will really like dig and dig and dig and dig. And I would come home. So I would like go to work, and before I would get up and go to work, I would meditate for like half hour, 45 minutes in the morning. Then I would go home, get back from work, meditate for another like half hour, 45 minutes. And then before bed, I would meditate for like an hour. Like I was so intense. And before this, I didn't even really believe in God. Like I never grew up in any kind of like setting like that. Like I did sort of maybe believe there was something, but this was like such a different experience for me. And I started to feel this overwhelming peace. Like before, the busy mind would come online, like when you sit in that awareness behind all of those racing thoughts all day long, it's like there's peace in that. And it's almost like, in a sense, time stops, right? Because you're only subject to time when you're in your thinking, right? And so I would sit down and be able to just, for me, it felt like I would unplug, and I could just hold this silence, or just this focus on like my breath or a single noise. I would often play like the sound of a fan because I'm very auditory, and just focus on building what's known as one pointedness, the ability to focus on a singular thing for long periods of time. And I recognize that from, this ego mind perspective, it was like when I was in that space behind all of my thoughts, I there's peace naturally for us. And the peace gets taken away when we go into our thinking and identifying with our thoughts and all the things we have to do later today, or all the things that happened yesterday, or all the things we have to be worried about, or how somebody hurt us, or how we're not good enough, or how somebody's going to abandon us, or whatever it is, right? And so when I was able to just step out of that and practice the skill of staying stepped out of that, not only was it peace when I would be in meditation, but it was peace when I would go throughout my day and be able to, you're almost like strengthening the muscle of being able to witness your thoughts rather than just identify with them and have them take you over all the time. And there's a lot of different like discussions about this across different backgrounds, different religions, spiritual practices, philosophies. One example is there's this idea of like Maya, right? And Maya is the illusion. And this concept talks about how when we go into the world, right, when we go into our everyday lives, we all see the world through this illusion. We're dreaming our world. And it's not actually like a dream, but in a sense, it's kind of like a daydream because we don't see objective reality. We see all of our preconditioned ideas, fears, concepts about reality. And nobody interacts with the same reality. Like there may be one objective reality, but we're all projecting our subjective programming onto reality. I'll give you an example. Let's say that we have two men, and we'll call them Tom and Bob. And let's say that Bob had really healthy relationships with women growing up, really close with his mom, got along with his sisters, had lots of female friends, feels really comfortable around women. And let's say that Tom had the total opposite experience, fought like crazy with his mom, didn't have good relationships with his sisters, a lot of wounding around women. And let's say they both go into a conference room, and that conference room, as they open the door and they go to walk into it, that conference room is full of women, and they didn't know. They thought it was just a co-ed conference, but it happens that they signed up for the wrong conference. As they both open the door and walk into the same objective reality, they are going to have completely unique subjective experiences, right? Bob's going to be like, "Oh, look at all these women. This will be so nice." And Tom is probably going to feel stressed, wounded, shut down, retracted in some kind of way, because in that moment, the women are a catalyst to trigger all of these preconditioned ideas, beliefs. And this happens all day long to all of us and in many different forms. And some of those most painful forms are sort of what I was talking about too. And I know anybody listening to this can relate, those times where we try to do something and we, in our mind, say we're not good enough, or we try to invest in something like a person or a relationship. And in our mind, as we get close, we say, oh, we're going to get abandoned or betrayed, or somebody's going to trap us. And we tell these stories, not because that's necessarily the objective reality, but because that's our subjective interpretation based on past conditioned events. Now, this is all throughout, this is in many various forms throughout different religions and philosophies. It's just communicated and expressed in different ways. So, anyways, for me during this time, I went down this rabbit hole of starting to get so into not just spirituality and meditation and reading from all these different perspectives, but also into psychology and really trying to see where these things overlap. And so, during this really deep path of self exploration, I started to get sober. And I had times during that first like little while that I relapsed or that things weren't like just smooth sailing. Like I didn't like meditate once and that was it. It was a process for me. But up until that period of time, I had been to rehab. I was in school for psychology and trying to, learn everything and the way it should work. And what was so meaningful to me wasn't through those systems. It was through me being able to, go to classes, come home and be a recluse and just read and study spirituality and the subconscious mind and just like everything that I could ever get my hands on. And as I began healing more and more, I started to try to want to figure out how I could reverse engineer what had helped me. Like, how is this working for me when all of these things that I was supposed to learn or supposed to do, or these programs I was, I was in rehab and these things are supposed to be working and they weren't. And by the way, this is not me saying if you are struggling with any kind of addiction, don't go to rehab. I'm not saying that at all. I actually believe that there's tremendous value in structure, in stability. And I think that what I'm actually getting at here is that for me, it was helpful to have a background in some of those things or experience some of those things, but be able to overlap with this whole other world that's out there that I think is really enriching. So I was like 20 years old and just finally experiencing all this relief after what felt like years of suffering and confusion. And I didn't have like a lot of friends I could really talk to about this stuff. I had some really good people in my life, some good friends, but not like, how do you talk about this kind of stuff with people? It just wasn't something. And I tried on a couple of occasions with different people in my life and it didn't go well. So it was kind of really negatively reinforced. So I was really shut down and kind of like on my own dealing with these things because I was, first of all, it was way too vulnerable for me to approach this. And second of all, it was hard to convey A, that I had been suffering so much for so long, and B, that suddenly I was having these like psychological and spiritual experiences between like meditation and finding peace through that and studying all these different, scripture and religions and all these different things. Um, and then studying the subconscious mind, which, back at this time, this is like coming up on 15 years ago, nobody like this wasn't as mainstream as it is now. So, anyways, I eventually sought out way more teachings, and my spiritual path kind of evolved and changed over time. But I was constantly trying to bridge psychology with spirituality and science. And I would do things like listen to Wayne Dyer every day, or I read all the books of Joseph Murphy and the subconscious mind, got certified in NLP and hypnosis, did a PhD in pastoral counseling, and eventually got certified in CBT, IFS, somatic experiencing, in so many different modalities. Just those are like a few. And I was just obsessed. I read probably all of the mainstream sort of spiritual books that you can think of as well. They were honestly a meaningful part of my journey. Like, and I highly recommend a lot of these, like the Mastery of Love, which is Don Miguel Ruiz, the author of The Four Agreements, which is also another great book, all of Michael Singer's work, of course, all the Eckhart Tolle work. And I sort of just replaced like one obsession or addiction with something totally different. And it worked for me. And this was honestly one of the most beautiful seasons of my life. It felt like what I was learning was magical. Like I couldn't believe after suffering so much and trying so hard to like will my way out of these things, I was finding ways to recondition and reprogram these inner terrible painful beliefs that were causing all this negative internal dialogue. And I was learning how to understand myself as a person better and find peace in so many different ways. And I guess one thing I've always personally been on is kind of a quest for truth. Like I'm always looking for what's the root cause or what's the bottom rung of the ladder. And I often found that when something very spiritual overlapped with something very psychologically rooted. So like one example of many, many, many would be, you there's a lot of like talk in sort of spiritual areas of like meditation, for example, because it's witnessing consciousness, right? You're able to witness your thoughts instead of just identify with them. And that same witnessing consciousness actually plays a huge role in a lot of somatic work, a lot of like somatic experiencing or somatic processing practices where you witness your emotions and the sensations. And so when I would start to see these things overlap, I'd be like, oh, this is sort of a seed for truth. And I would try them and I would practice them and I would see the results in my own personal life. And so when there's different modalities that seem to arrive at the same conclusion, like that was such a powerful thing for me to keep going down the rabbit hole of. And over time, I honestly came to eventually conclude personally, this is what I believe, that many forms of modern day psychology tools actually have roots of inspiration. I'm not going to say that they're like literally taken right out word for word, but have roots of inspiration from a lot of different spiritual practices. And I don't talk about God much on this channel or a lot of these different things. Of course, we talk about core wounds and reprogramming the subconscious because I really want to be open and accepting to all forms of relationship to God. I know that that's a tough one for a lot of people, but I'm not, who am I to ever tell people what they should think or believe? But no matter how much I dove into spirituality, I really focused on, taking the dogma out of a lot of things that I was studying and instead being like, how do I develop a really personal relationship to a higher power? So, I will tell you a couple things that happened to me as I went down this path a little bit more. And one of them is that I had this big core wound of like, I am alone that was really strong for me. I think because I felt kind of alone in like what I was dealing with from a really young age and at an early time. And I also felt like I was kind of in between worlds. I felt like I was around party friends or people who um, maybe were sharing in some of the experiences I was going through, but I didn't feel like they were trying to like solve for them. And I felt like I really wanted out in a lot of ways, but couldn't seem to. And then, so I kind of felt like I had one foot in and one foot out sometimes of like what I was experiencing, not all the time, but in phases. And then I felt kind of alone and like I didn't know how to talk to people about it or how to share about some of the hard things that I was experiencing because it was so vulnerable for me and I was really not good at being vulnerable. It was really really difficult for me. And that seemed to just go away when I started to really believe in God, and I started to really believe in God when I felt like I experienced a peace, like the peace that in my opinion kind of came from that relationship to what we are behind all of the conditioning, behind all of the busy thinking, ego mind. There's a peace in that awareness that we are behind that or beneath it. And the more I was rooted in that and spent time in that, the more I kind of felt this natural connection to God. And I saw other interesting things in my life and things like a lot of synchronicities playing out or just things that seem to reinforce that there was something so much greater than myself. It definitely helped speed some of my attachment healing. I stopped worrying about like abandonment so much or things like that. And I kind of felt this inner freedom having experienced what it was like to spend more time behind the ego or conditioned mind, which in my opinion is also the subconscious mind. And I've very much overlapped those two things. I stopped being so harsh and critical to myself. I accepted that I'm a human being and that I am imperfect and that it's okay to make mistakes as long as I'm willing to make things right and show up for those things. And I felt a sense of deeper safety in my life. Like, oh, it's not just there's a whole world instead of just this conditioned world of how you should be and show up and succeed, or like, the pressures of culture or society. There's honestly so many things I could say that shifted for me. I don't think it was just being on a spiritual path. I think it was very much honestly overlapping, like practical, like how can I understand what I'm experiencing from the spiritual perspective and really then map it out from a psychological or scientific perspective, having dove into things like cognitive behavioral therapy or neurolinguistic programming or the subconscious mind and understanding more about neuroplasticity and how we're programmed, how we acquire conditioned patterns at a subconscious level, and just so many different things. But I think that togetherness of the two was actually very, very meaningful. So, where am I now? I don't meditate for 3 hours a day any longer. I still meditate every day. I rarely miss a day. And if I do, I'll generally try to like make up for it a little more the next day. But not for as long, not for hours and hours. I think I'm more in a rooted sense of peace. I really needed that to cope at the time. And it's been a long time. We're talking about almost 15 years later now. And I have an evening routine where I still read spiritual passages every evening and journal about how they apply to me and to my life. And I am forever grateful that I found a relationship to God because it helped me really climb out of a really, really dark time when I felt like I didn't have any way of climbing out of that. So, anyways, if you're open to it, I might share learnings on here sometimes. I don't talk much about this part of my life because sometimes I get a little bit nervous that it would feel like I'm pushing my views on people in an area that I feel like I want to respect as a very personal area for people. But I realized that I may do more of a disservice by not sharing how powerful and beautiful this was for me in my own healing journey and experience. My hope is that it may be validating or reassuring or just connecting with you if anybody's listening and feels like they're on a same path or some of these things have helped them too. So anyway, that's it for my video today. If you have questions or anything like that, I would love to hear from you. And I hope you have the best day. And thank you so much for listening.